Excited to jump into the conversation. Colleen is going to kick us off with our welcome.
I always forget to unmute. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. My name is Colleen Wynn, and I am the staff assistant at the African American Resource Center. And I just kind of wanted to go through a process of how we got here tonight with this program. So there should come a time in each one of our lives where we stop long enough to scan our environments while being aware of communities and people who every day face unjust treatment and scores of isms that target them for being treated unfairly. Now, while we are scanning our environment, we must also do it in conjunction with exploring our own prejudices. The only times that we should stand on the sidelines is when we are there long enough to refuel before we jump back into a phrase that I heard before, mind other people's business for justice sake. Years of conversations we have had at the African American Resource Center where we have been forced to have conversations regarding systemic racism and its cousins of unjust treatment, hostility, violence, and all other forms of discrimination. So the African American Resource Center, acting in accordance, created the Allyship series that is being held in collaboration with other departments where real conversations can be started and expounded on that will shed light on the need to support, empower, and stand up for and together with other communities that face these unnecessary atrocities that over time become soul killers for many people. The first in our allyship series was held in April, and it was entitled Race, Solidarity, and Allyship. Tonight, Race, Solidarity, and Allyship, Embracing Our Black LGBTQ plus siblings is the second installment of this ongoing series. And I also want you to be on the lookout for part 3, which right now is entitled Brave Conversations Between Black and Asian Colleagues. Now, to get our program started, I would like to introduce you to tonight's moderator, which is Malik Muhammad. And just a little bit about Malik, who I love this brother right here because he is the bomb diggity, real bomb diggity. Malik Muhammad is an Associate Director of the LGBT Center. He is a Philadelphia native. Malik holds a bachelor's degree in psychology as well as a master's degree in higher education counseling and student affairs from Westchester University, WCU of Pennsylvania. He is a proud brother of the Pennsylvania Tau chapter of Sigma Phi Epsilon fraternity. Malik's passion for social justice began at an early age as the son and grandson of phenomenal change agents in the Philadelphia African American Muslim community. The passion was reignited and started to flourish during his 6-year academic and paraprofessional career at WCU. There, he came to realize the deep significance of the LGBTQ plus advocacy, education, and working with an intersectional lens at the higher education level and in all walks of life. Now, years later, Malik is a change agent himself. At Penn, he diligently works to support students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community members, spearheading the center's educational programs, advising LGBTQ plus student groups, and fostering collaboration across the university with various other roles. Malik also serves the community, the Philadelphia community, as a member of the Penn Center for AIDS Research Community Advisory Board, that's CFAR, the Colors Organization Board, and as a talented, let me say that again, as a talented local artist, entertainer. Let's give it up for this brother. From the moment you meet him, Malik's genuine, energetic, and optimistic nature is undeniable, and often it is very much contagious. If you haven't already, find out for yourself, and you got to meet this brother in person. So let me turn it over to Malik Muhammad. There you go, brother.
Oh, thank you so much. You You warm my heart. You warm my heart so much. Thank you all so much for being here today. As Colleen said, my name is Malik Muhammad. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm just excited to lean into this conversation because it is one that has been greatly needed for far too long within our communities and communities beyond. Colleen already gave you some context of how and why we got here today, but I just wanted to add one more thing. You know, when we think about Black communities, African-American communities, there is an extremely harmful sense of rampant homophobia, transphobia within our communities that has to be addressed. We have to bring it forward. It makes me think about over the summer when we heard about the young boy in Atlanta, Georgia, who was ridiculed and verbally abused and physically abused by his family because of they would suspected him of being gay. Right? And how often do we hear of those stories in our communities? How often do we ostracize our youth for coming into their own understanding of who they are and who they want to be? We have to do better. So I'm excited to be here with some other amazing, phenomenal change agents here in the city of Philadelphia and here in the city, or here at the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm going to introduce our panelists for today, one of which is not here yet, but I'm still going to give her the proper introduction that she deserves. But first up, we have joining us here today, Selena Morrison. Selena, originally from North Carolina, her advocacy work has always been driven by her desire to be of service. She served as community engagement specialist of the Mazzoni Center for several years right here in Philadelphia. Also served as a recovery specialist at Morris Home, where she supported trans and gender nonconforming individuals as they developed the knowledge, skills, and advocacy necessary to promote sobriety. She was the director of programs at the William Way LGBT Community Center, where she was instrumental in opening the Aquila Adams Trans Resource Center there. During her years working with nonprofits, Selena helped educate communities, businesses, agency boards, colleges, nonprofit organizations, and religious establishments. She served on the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations from 2018 to 2020 and was honored as one of Philadelphia Pride's 2019 Grand Marshals. Philadelphia Magazine named her one of 2020's 76 most influential Philadelphians, and I can full-heartedly agree. Selena is currently serving as the executive director of the Philadelphia Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs, one of the only offices across this country. So Selena, thank you so much for being here with us today. If you'd like to say hello, feel free to do so.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. I'm excited.
Yes.
This is a much overdue conversation.
Yes, cannot wait to have your wisdom and experience shared with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Our next panelist who is here with us today is Malik Washington, my dear brother. Malik Washington is the Director of Sexual Violence Prevention and Education here at the University of Pennsylvania. As an educator, advocate, and facilitator, their work relies on engaging theories of community building and accountability, Black feminism, abolition, and restorative and transformative justice to understand and end systems of violence. Malik is an advocate for youth empowerment and the agency of young people in their education and lived experiences. So excited to have you here with us today, Malik. And as a fellow colleague here at Penn, I can tell you now, you have been so instrumental in my growth and development as a person, which I know you are continuing to do for other folks, and especially our youth. So if you want to pop in and say hello, feel free to do so.
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Malik. Thank you, African American Resource Center. Just very grateful to be here and participate in this conversation. So, and likewise, Malik, I'm grateful for your leadership on campus and in these issues, and I'm just grateful.
Yes. Pleasure to have you with us. Excited to hear from you as well. Our last panelist for tonight, who will be joining with us in about 15 minutes or so, she is a very busy person, but she's going to hop in when she can, is Vinchell. Vinchell is the tri-state tribal queen on the scene. She was voted 2017 Philadelphia Drag Queen of the Year, as well as Best Hostess. While running Shea Butter Work Productions, she hosts and produces several shows in the tri-state area, including Black Girl Magic, a show highlighting local Black entertainers, voted Philadelphia's best monthly show 2 years in a row. Her main purpose in drag is to make sure you have a good time, as well as use her platform to promote Black excellence and spread her African culture. Check out more on Vinchell at vinchell.com. That's VINCHELL.com. I'll make sure I post that in the chat as well. And as I said, Vinchell will be joining us around 6 p.m. or so. But we're excited to have Vinchell as someone that is a prominent figure within the African-American queer community here in the city of Philadelphia. As I mentioned in her bio, she is the premier queen here in the city. And we are so excited to have her expertise and experience and knowledge to share with us today. So those are our panelists, and I'll be kind of moderating our conversation for today. So we have a couple of questions that we are going to ask directly to our panelists, and they're going to share their thoughts. But then we are also going to turn the floor over to our amazing guests that are here with us today to ask any questions or thoughts that you may have. So I encourage you, as we are engaging in this conversation, if you have any thoughts, any questions that pop up for you, write them down, make sure you note them so we can have them ready when we move into our Q&A section towards the end of our time together. So to get us started, Malik and Selena, we got to dig into this. We got to dig into this because, as we said, this is a conversation that has been long overdue. And it might be happening in a variety of different capacities, but we needed it to happen here, in this context, and in our communities. So my first question that I'm going to pose to you both, why? Why do you believe there's a need for this conversation in the first place within our Black and African American communities, but even more so, especially here in the city of Philadelphia? What do you got? Y'all ain't got to be
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute. I think this year, the acute discrimination that Black LGBTQ people face has been brought to the forefront. Many of us, we've always known that this has been happening, but Black LGBT people have been severely affected by, the global pandemic, as well as the trauma of systemic racism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia experienced by the entire community. And now more than ever, I think, we need Black folks to step up and take action. As this national conversation around racial justice and equality for Black people grows, in its volume and scope, many Black LGBTQ young people are still facing, having those difficult conversations with people who are uninformed about race, queer identities, and the intersections of both of those things.
Yes, thank you so much, Selena. I love how you coined that. I've been using the phrase, the global awakening to racism and oppression in our country.
Yes.
And that overarching essence has also brought to light so many of the major concerns that we're seeing within Black LGBTQ plus communities. So appreciate that so much. Malik, what do you got?
Sure, thank you. And Selena, I appreciate hearing your thoughts, and I just want to say I'm grateful to share this space with you as well. Reflecting on some of the things that you have shared, and just thinking about is that, the importance of this is, for me, is thinking about all of our lived experiences and the way that these things have been divided in a discourse, in a national discourse that is not always honest and authentic to who we actually are. And so when we talk about, you say those intersections of our identity, those intersections of our experience, those things, and even the way that intersectionality has been used as a term is often erasing the ways that we're moving in and out of it, the way that we share these identities. And I particularly think about, referencing and thinking about to the Combahee River Collective, right? And thinking about Black women, Black feminist women, many of whom were queer, who came together to think about how are we fighting for gender justice? How are we fighting for the rights and the lived experiences of Black women? And realizing and understanding and articulating that if we center the most marginalized, if we think about the folks who are the most impacted by issues of homophobia, sexism, racism, and thinking specifically in this instance, Black queer individuals, Black queer women, Black queer families, Black queer trans individuals, right? If we center those folks who have been the most marginalized on multiple identities, right, then we're freeing us all, right? And so it's not just a matter of, oh, we are specifically thinking about, you know, queer experiences. No, how are these things interlapping, and specifically for Black queer folks, like, how are we experiencing all of these things together and simultaneously and impacting us? And if we center those experiences, then we're creating the space and the freedom for all of us.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Malik. I love how you brought up this notion of intersectionality being a buzzword right now, right? And folks are just tossing it around without fully understanding the intricacies of what intersectionality really is, but more so, how do we actually go beyond just talking about it and actually bringing it into action, right? And allowing ourselves to be honest with those disparities that we are seeing so wound up in the multiple layers of our identity, right? And the other piece of it that at times gets frustrating is there's this essence of what I like to call the oppression Olympics, right? Where people are constantly pitting different forms of oppression against each other. And we see that a lot within the Black community versus the LGBTQ plus community. But as you're mentioning, we have to realize that our oppressions are wound up within each other. And how can we really move the needle forward in terms of all of us recognizing that? So thank you both so much. You've already started the conversation out in a beautiful way. Let me come to my second question. Because when we think about this essence of allyship, that's another word that's kind of tossed around in a variety of ways. So I wonder if y'all could share, what are the differences and or similarities between being an ally, being an accomplice, and an advocate for LGBTQ plus communities? All right, what are some of those differences there? Any thoughts?
I guess I'll go first. I think, you know, being a true ally is about accepting, supporting, advocating for the LGBTQ community. While an accomplice recognizes that it requires more than just accepting and advocating on behalf of the community. Being an ally is really, you know, one of the first steps in this race that we're in for equality. But being a real ally should embody advocating, because an advocate is defined as a person who publicly supports the LGBTQ community, but some allies don't advocate, but yet you're absolutely right. And those are the instances where that word is thrown around. Now, the term accomplice encompasses allyship, but goes beyond advocacy. An accomplice uses their privilege to challenge, you know, existing conditions and pushing those barriers, you know, at the risk of their comfort.
At the risk of their comfort, at the risk of them losing power in some way.
Yes.
I love how you brought forward, right? When folks hold privilege, right? When they hold some form of a privileged identity, it's one thing to have that awareness.
Yes.
But it's another thing to step forward and say, I'm going to use that privilege to help uplift and bring forward more oppressed identities, but also I'm going to use it to push against the privilege in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
You have to be willing to relinquish that power.
See, allyship is a real comfortable place to stay in and to remain in, you know. So I often ask people, you know, when especially with whether they're self-proclaimed ally or not, I always ask, how long have they been an ally, and how long do they intend to stay in that space?
Yes, I like that. You challenged them a little bit. You're like, where are you at?
Because you have to move past allyship.
Yes, thank you so much, Selena. I appreciate that. Moving, again, the needle forward, past allyship, into accomplishment, into solidarity. We'll get there. Malik, what you got for us?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate the emphasis, Selena, on risk, right? And like, what is the level of risk that you're taking? And one of the ways that I think about it as well is like, you know, when we do violence prevention and we think about individuals who have been harmed, individuals who are perpetrators of that harm, facilitators and bystanders to that, part of the concept is that sometimes we're like moving in and out of these different spaces, and that these identities are kind of like not a fixed thing, right? Like we move throughout them, right? And we don't, there's not a moment of like achievement, right? You don't achieve this place of allyship. Rather, it's a common practice. It's a constant practice that you continue to move, right? And evoke in different ways. And I would say that about all of these words and all these terms that we use, is like, they're not these fixed identities. We can't, oh, I have reached this place of accomplishment. You may have demonstrated that in moments, but it's more of a question of what are we doing and what is our practice? And we shouldn't think of liberation, freedom, and justice as a destination, an arrival point, but rather something that we are frequently and commonly practicing and owning and improving on, right?
Yes, it is a daily practice. It is not a final destination that I'm looking to get to. I love there was this analogy in a TED Talk, and I can't remember the person's name by the life of me, but they basically talked about being a good person or being someone that advocates for marginalized communities is not just something you do once, just like you don't just brush your teeth once, right? It's not like, oh, you brush your teeth and now you're clean for the rest of your life. No, it's a continuous practice. You have to daily brush your teeth to keep your teeth clean. You have to put into action daily practices that allow you to be that advocate that you're saying you are, that ally that you're saying you are, right? Putting things into action. Being an ally and accomplice is not just who you are, it's what you do. It's what you do. How are you actually coming forward and standing up for folks within the LGBTQ plus community, right? And finding those different avenues, because there's lots of ways to do it, right? And folks have to find their lane. They have to find their lane in terms of what they can do and really make something actionable. I really, really appreciate that. So keeping in line with kind of that notion of allyship, accompliship, can we talk a little bit about the difference between allyship and solidarity, right? Because that's another one that comes up for folks. They're like, oh yeah, I stand in solidarity, but what the heck does that even mean? I don't know what you're saying when you say that. So could y'all speak a little bit to what is that difference? And maybe what does solidarity look like in our communities? And when I say our, I mean our Black and African American communities.
Our very own Ernest Owens, I think it was 2017, wrote an article about why he was giving up on allies. And he spoke about how too many allies view support for our marginalized communities as a social contract with terms and conditions. And I think that is really significant in the Black community, where the support is based on terms and conditions. And a lot of times those terms and conditions are their one interaction with a trans woman, with a Black trans woman. So they are, that one interaction, is like, I don't want to deal with those people, so it's based off of those conditions. Another issue for me is that allyship tends to, one reason why I challenge folks when they have deemed themselves an ally is allyship validates the ally and not the marginalized. So solidarity is when others deeply understand our oppression and its source. They're able to say Black trans lives matter without feeling the scarcity that somehow their cis communities' concerns and needs are being made invisible or being erased by supporting our community. They're able to say Black lives matter, not out of guilt and shame for their privilege, but out of their shared goal to dismantle the root of the cause.
Yes, so it's bringing forward that risk again, yeah, but also recognizing that it goes beyond and not honing in on you, right? Oftentimes folks are making too much things about themselves, absolutely, about the other. And although I'm working to uplift others, does not mean I can't still uplift myself and folks of other communities, right? Absolutely. Again, it's coming from that place of like, people have this belief you can only focus on one issue at a time. And if that's the thing you're focusing on, then you're leaving everybody else out.
Yeah, in our community, I think it's one of the biggest examples of that is, there's this Do you support trans women or cis women? You can't support both.
But when we think about it, women are women, right?
Yeah.
But then that intersection does come in when
Yes.
we think about trans folks, when we think about
Yeah.
Black trans folks, right?
Yeah.
We got to pay attention. We got to pay attention. And people are not allowing themselves to pay attention, right? They're not even willing to take that effort to learn. So let me say this here and now. Thank you to everybody on this call. Thank you to those that are going to be watching this later, because you're taking the time and the energy to try. A little bit of try goes a long way. Malik.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just echoing that. But Malik, I think you distinguished that, like, folks think that there's single issue problems, right? And I think Audre Lorde spoke to that in many ways, is that we don't live single issue lives, right? And that's not an appropriate way that we can address that. When I think about solidarity, it is a space, though, of acknowledging the ways in which the harms of others harm us as well, and can become our direct harm. So you may not be directly harmed by something, but to understand its residual impact on people that, on you, the people that you love, the communities and the spaces that you exist in, and also understand the ability and the capacity of those same forces to then at some point directly harm you, right? And so, I'm thinking about so many of the things that have, happened and become prominent media narratives, particularly in the last 5 years or so. And these were issues in which we can think to ourselves, well, how might this come back around? And you may not think this affects you, but how might it come around? And it actually does harm you, and it actually does hurt you. And getting people to make those connections, I think, is a really important thing, if in fact, they're not able to see the direct harm. I think that's also a pathway into not only just acknowledging the harm, but also building relationships and thinking about the relationships that we have with one another and how we are seeing with one another, and how that also impacts how we interpret the harms and experiences that we have. Like, I'm thinking about a situation like in my own family, where a member, was speaking, very, not just insensitively and potentially harmful about Black queer experiences, but in a way that seemed so distant, right? As though it was not near to them. And the intervention that I think that we had, which was a subtle intervention, was identifying that actually you have a member of your family. This is a nephew, right? Your nephew. What do you think about how your nephew lives and how he experiences the world? And bringing that home and say, oh, well, actually, I didn't experience that. Maybe this is somebody that I love. This was their experience, that this was a harm, because I had distances to think that the queer experience was another, not that it was right here in my lived life and in my family. How many of us have distanced ourselves from harms? I think in the same thing about my direct work in sexual violence, where people think about, no, somebody else has experienced that. And we know, strictly by the prevalence of the rates of sexual violence in our communities, that we all know somebody who has experienced this, right? So what is it that is encouraging us to distance ourselves from problems? What does it say about the relationships we have with one another? Have we created the environments where folks feel like they can share honestly about their experiences, and that we will respond and show up in some type of way, right? And what do we need to do to address that in our personal lives? I always think to ourselves that we often talk about harm from a large experience, but the hardest and also the most important is where it's nearest to us. That's always where it's most difficult. And if we think about the relationships that are most intimate and most important to us and nearest to us, how does that inform how we will then navigate our relationships in the world?
I'm telling you right now, if I would have been unmuted through, how many times I said, and yes.
Me too.
I'm telling you, this is why we needed and wanted you to be a part of this conversation, because you're thinking about the essence of harm that is happening within our communities constantly, but the interconnectedness of that harm, right? And bringing it basic down to the level of, it's all about relationships. The relationships that we have with ourselves, the relationships that we have with each other, the relationship we have with our larger community. And too often as you're mentioning, we are constantly othering folks and saying that that can never approach my life in any way. That can never be any part of who I am or my inner circle. But I'm here to tell you, it is. It is. Because Black queer folks are everywhere, everywhere. And we have to realize how we are engaging in harmful ways. One thing that really pisses me off today, people are like, oh, it's 2020, 2021. Everybody's just so sensitive. Nobody can take a joke anymore. It's not about that. It's recognizing that we have been engaging in extremely harmful ways for far too long, that we have to address, that we have to be willing to own and take accountability for harming people. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, we have to hold ourselves accountable. Selena, please.
Yes, I'm glad that Malik brought that up because, I'm almost 50 and I am still educating my family on, you can't say that, you can't, and a lot of that is they base their opinions of, for example, Black trans women off of their experiences with me. Oh, well, you never acted like that. They use terms that are derogatory. Oh, well, we don't look at you like that. They've separated my identity, which is insulting to me. So, but I also understand as Black folks, there are some times that we choose our battles and it's like, not today, girl. But that is a constant thing that we see in our communities and I deal with it to this day.
Yeah. And as you're starting to mention, sometimes it's just coming from a place of a lack of education, but then also an unwillingness to even try and learn, right? Sometimes we are rooting ourselves in what we think we know and what we have known for so long that we're not willing to expand, right? And take a deeper look at who we are as people, especially in our Black LGBTQ plus communities. It's, yes, daring, it's culturally passed down, right? It's something that is a lineage of harmful behaviors and engagements that we have to pay attention to. We have to pay attention to. Oh, y'all digging into some good stuff today. Thank you. So thinking about that, and we're leaning right into this question, what are the challenges, the fears, or even the risks that come along with being an accomplice with LGBTQ folks within the Black and African American community? What is holding people back, right? Where are those fears? What are those challenges that are really keeping us from really standing in solidarity and being accomplished with our Black LGBTQ plus siblings?
I'm gonna keep my answer short because I am dying to hear Malik's answer to this one. But I'm gonna say for me, and I'm gonna speak from my experience. One of the biggest challenges in the Black community is the stigma of being identified as LGBTQ plus. And what I mean by that is the guilty by association mentality of our community keeps many of our Black cis straight men from even advocating for the very folks that they secretly love, care for, and even sleep with. I mean, there are many challenges and fears because, this disruption isn't easy and it definitely isn't polite. So, yeah.
Yes, those assumptions. It's the assumptions that people are constantly making about who you are, how you identify, and how you engage in your world.
And even if they're not making those assumptions, they're concerned that they're going to be made. That stigma is so heavy.
That's that extreme form of homophobia. I cannot even remotely be seen as something other than straight, other than cisgender. And if I am, oh my God, right? We freak out without giving ourselves the freedom to just be. And with that, I want to welcome in our dear Vinchell. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello.
We gave you a wonderful introduction earlier. We are excited to have you with us. You are simply phenomenal, such a change agent here in the city of Philadelphia. So thank you for joining us. We are just answering a question right now. Selena just shared The question is, what are the challenges, fears, and risks of being an accomplice with LGBTQ plus folks within Black communities?
That's such a great question. I think someone's TV's on in the back though. I heard that. But yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, me being a drag queen, I am a cisgendered male. That's kind of how I identify as when I'm out of drag. And it can be difficult because, you know, in the world of being Black and, you know, being gay or masculine and feminine, a lot of times we were, you know, told that we can't do it, or you can't be too feminine, you can't be too this, you can't be too that. So I know that my whole life, I was kind of just raised to be masculine. You know, my father always was like, you have to be this way. But then, of course, once I started to dabble in drag, I started to experience a lot of different things. And now I'm at the point where I'm not non-binary. I mean, I am what I am. Like, I don't know what I am. You know what I mean? It is what it is. Like, I am Vinchelle, I'm Vincent, I am a drag queen. But when I'm out of drag, I'm Vincent. And for me, like the pronouns and everything, it's just, I'm like so equal opportunity employer, shall I say. So, and I think that a lot of people can identify that with me, because a lot of times, a lot of people don't know if they want to be non-binary. A lot of times, a lot of people don't know if they even want to be trans or not. But I can relate to the people who are cisgendered, who are still, you know, feminine or whoever they want to be, but they don't have to necessarily fit a certain quota for anything like that. And I know in the Black community, a lot of times people want us to kind of pick one side. And I'm here to break all those barriers and do it all, honey. Yeah. So that's what I try to do. So yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. You know, I think you bring up this really good notion of the strict traditional ways and gender roles that we are constantly being pushed onto us, but then we are also pushing onto others at times, right? But I love that you were finding that sense of freedom, right? Sometimes even just breaking it down and saying, I don't feel like labeling myself in any way. I'm me, and that's all that should matter. Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Vinchelle. Malik, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about a number of the things that I heard, and I'm thinking about kind of like the spaces and layers of conversations and the things that may happen, you know, in our small spaces among us in our community and our family, and the larger spaces and larger narratives, like sometimes that are filtered through the media. And to like specifically think about the question, like, what are some of the challenges? Well, I think for so long, the way that LGBTQ queerness has been presented has been as a white experience, as a white issue. When you think about largely in politically in the media and some of the big issues that have come up over the past decades or so, like the representation in the media, what is the queerness that has been the most comfortable for those institutions to share and to demonstrate and put forth? And often that has been, you know, the issues of white gay men, right? Like, and so I think that for a lot of us, from our experience, and I'm thinking about Black folks, like there is also thinking about, oh, this queerness thing, this queerness issue is a white thing. I think about specifically a law professor at Georgetown Law, who after same-sex marriage was legalized on a national level, and had argued that, you know, this was an issue that became the forefront of queer issues, largely because of the money, and specifically the influence of white gay men who thought this was the most important issue for us, right? We want the privileges of straight cis white men, right? And being able to marry, though it is important for many of us and all of us, that was what was most important to them. When we know for Black queer folks that we have issues like large rates of youth homelessness, we have issues in thinking about HIV, like these are some of the most pressing issues for us and that are affecting us directly, that are much more significant than what becomes the national conversation, because it's been driven by the interests of white advocates. And so I think a lot of our folks in our community are having that challenge of, this is how I'm receiving this, and deciphering that. So the way that I think is, again, is to think about it and bring it home. And what does that mean to us? I also think there's another thing, and maybe this was articulated best in pop culture if folks had saw Master of None on Netflix, and specifically the Thanksgiving issue that Lena Waithe had directed, Lena Waithe herself being a Black queer woman. And in that episode, also Angela Bassett, who was serving as her mother, And I think about the fear of families who are fearful of us having that double oppression, right? Like, being Black is hard enough. I have a difficult time accepting that you are also queer and how that's going to impact your life in living in this world. And I think some of our families are approaching that from a position of care, right? Even if in fact it ultimately causes harm, right? And so how do we decipher from that? How do we think about and center those Black queer experiences? Well, one of the texts that I really appreciate is Saidiya Hartman, and she has a book called Wayward Lives, and it's about the experiences of Black women and Black queer folks in Philadelphia and New York around the time of the Great Migration, right? And she's articulating through the archives, through the official city archives, through the, from what we know as the slave narratives that came out during that time as well, the way that Black women and Black queer individuals who may have not named themselves as such lived their lives and lived a way that was best for their survival, right? They didn't put a label on it. Maybe today we would call it queer. Maybe today we would call it gender non-conforming or non-binary. But these were individuals, Black folks, who lived their lives to the best of their degrees, defining their sexuality and their gender expression as they wished. And a lot of those experiences are also the basis to which white folks have learned from and centered and put forth as being gay culture, and then is read as white when it's actually us. Like we were actually demonstrating what it means to live and express our lives like this, right? And then we get erased from that. And so, you know, that's a difficult thing to, I think, sift through, right, on its own if we're not familiar with that history and not familiar with those experiences.
Yes, you brought forward so many beautiful points. One, this notion of historical context and how at times and often we are prioritizing the experiences of whiteness, right? And how those experiences are uplifted, those are how movements get pushed forward, but so much of it is ripped from the experiences of us as Black folks, right? And the freedom that we have found that they are constantly trying to adhere to. And unfortunately, as you're noting, so many movements are more prioritized once it becomes a white issue, right? But I also love the notion of how you talked about family, and that essence of a lot of times that fear may be coming from a place of care, right? Or from a place of love, of not wanting to have to live in this world today as a Black queer person, right? But we also have to acknowledge how, although that might be coming from a place of love and care, that harm is still being done, right? And how do we not ostracize our own by trying to make them adhere to what they want us to do? Not here for it. I'm not here for it. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Vinchell, I would like to at least pose one question to you that we asked earlier, so we can get you in, and then we'll continue on with some of the other questions. I think the one that I think would be most interesting to hear from you is, can you share a little bit about what you see as the differences or similarities or what have you between being an ally, an accomplice, or an advocate for LGBTQ plus communities, especially within our Black communities and here in Philadelphia?
You mean as far as like the white allies, you mean?
I mean, however you want to take it, please bring it to me. Bring it to me.
I have so much to say about that. You know, last year was very eye-opening for sure. I think, as we all know on this screen, this was not the first time that police brutality has happened last year. Last year was not the first time a police officer has done anything to a Black person. Last year was not the first time a Black person has been discriminated against. Last year was not the first time a Karen, quote unquote, has come about. It just was filmed. So we all have seen it, right? And I had and I talked to my mom about this, I had a huge issue when it came to the allies, because somewhat for me, it became very performative, I felt. And that's when I kind of held back, because my platform and who I was, I've always been such an advocate. I've done my show Black Girl Magic in Philly for almost 3 years now. So that was past last year. I was preaching this a while ago. And I've had this issue where a lot of the white queer community is now all of a sudden coming out to the show. Now all of a sudden supporting. And you know, of course, in 2019, when I was screaming BLM, they didn't care. But all of a sudden now it's an issue. So my big thing is I've been trying to decipher who is being real and who is not being real. And you can tell people's genuine heart. I think a lot of people on the screen knows who has a good heart or not. And I think for me, it's all about the action. A lot of people can talk. A lot of people can make a Facebook status. A lot of people can make a tweet, a Twitter. But at the end of the day, what are you doing to prevent that? Are you still doing those microaggressions? Are you still, as far as in my world, are you still only booking white queens? Are you not booking black queens? Or are you only booking one black queen in the show still? So we're still dealing with that here in Philly, or in the performance community, and it's very eye-opening for sure. And I know that I have weeded out, so like the performative ones and the allies, and I just hope that the allies are true allies, because at the end of the day, we're the only people that knows how to be black. We're the only people that have walked this life. No white person can tell me how to be black. No white person can tell me how to live my life as a black man, woman, person, not a non-binary, anybody. No white person can do that. No white trans person can do that. And no white non-binary person can teach me how to be black. And I think as far as last year and as far as everything that happened, I'm hoping that now, in a way, I'm trying to look at it as a pro and a con. In a way, I'm like, okay, now their eyes are open and now they can see, but they should have seen already, because I've been talking about this for a long time. So that's kind of my balance right now. So yeah.
I hear that. Reconciling that balance is hard at times, right? Because I'm glad that the awakening happened to some degree. I'm annoyed that it took so long, but now I'm also interested, okay, what are you going to do about it, right? It's about the action instead of, oh yeah, I'm an ally. Oh my God, my uncle is gay. Oh yeah, I went to that very show.
I have black friends, yes. And I think now, I'm sorry, I just want to say one thing. And I think now is the time that we can tell who is the ally, because remember, the statuses are gone, the tweets are gone, but the stuff is still happening. And I'm hoping that I'm still preaching about it. And I see a lot of my black people around me are still preaching about it. But it's just interesting to see how quickly they're willing to switch on to another subject. So yeah.
Yes. Well, that gives us an excellent segue into our next question, which is basically about performative allyship. So how can we encourage, and I think for this one, we want to talk about within our Black communities, how can we move beyond Pride Month activism or National Coming Out Day activism, that performative nature that we sometimes see from folks. How can we move beyond that? How do we encourage folks to go beyond?
In my office, we see this all the time. When we're approaching Pride Month, there's an influx of like, oh, we want to support the community, want to do this. But people who identify as LGBT do so 365 days every year, whether they're out or not. And support is needed beyond the scope of Pride Month. Activism is an everyday action. And activism means that, that we fight for equality and access and safety in all spaces, and recognize the privilege and transfer that power to others. Black and brown folks really need to recognize their ability to affect change through solidarity. If we lead by example and work towards building an equitable society, I think, we'll be on the right path.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of that as well. I think that's amazing. And I want to say that it does take us as Black people as well to set the tone and to set the change. If a lot of the other races see us fighting each other, seeing us, go after each other, they're going to just think that we don't even value ourselves. So I think that it does start with us as a foundation and as a housework. We do have to tell each other, hey, You know, we're not going to do that. That's why it killed me when I heard about all the black men, you know, beating up the black trans woman. That just put it so back. And that doesn't need to happen. We all need to stand together in solidarity and show these other races how strong we are.
I like that. Using us as the foundation to see the change that needs to happen. And how can we collectively come together and stop pitting ourselves amongst even each other? Yeah. Malik, any thoughts?
I'm mostly just vibing off of that. I appreciate Selena and Venture. I appreciate those responses.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, I like to put that question in because, as Vinchel was starting to even note, is that we are constantly seeing different forms of performative activism, performative allyship. So we wanted to just talk that through. What can you do? Stand with each other. Stop making those assumptions. Give yourself the opportunity to come together, because they love it when we fight. They love to see the quote unquote black on black crime. They love to see the black on black violence, right? We have to find a way of not perpetuating that narrative, but also understand the historical context of how we got there in the first place. It's wild. It's a lot. Let's bring it on in. Another thing to think about, because we've been talking a lot about kind of the assumptions, the prejudices, the traditional essence that folks hold on to. So how do we encourage Black folks to challenge their own personal prejudices, and especially those towards Black and brown trans and non-binary folks? Any thoughts around that?
Did someone, okay, I guess I'll go first again. I think encouraging Black folks to think about, you know, why these feelings exist. You know, what is the real underlying cause of the prejudice? I think in many cases, we never really find out where that comes from. No one ever wants to answer, like, why do you hate this group of people? Challenging them to reflect on their own experiences and revisit, I think, their own experiences with injustices and bias and discrimination, especially if we're talking about other Black and brown people. Of course, it's important to recognize the humanity in all of us, despite our differences and the diversity that exists among us. You know, we are people first, and everybody is deserving of love, compassion, dignity, respect, and acknowledgement. But we also, have to recognize that type of change can be difficult for some, and many are educated and socialized to believe only certain forms of existence are true or valued. So one of the ways I think to change that narrative is to for them to be open to self-reflection and answer those questions. What is it about another person's visibility that makes you feel threatened?
What is it about someone else's visibility that makes you feel threatened? Wow. And really taking that step to do that self-reflection, right? Asking yourself the question, why? Why do you hold this belief? Why is this sense of quote unquote lifestyle so disarming to you, right? And a lot of times it has more to do with you than it does anybody else. Mm-hmm.
I also think that it also has to do with society as well. I think society has built up, especially in the Black community, making us act a certain type of way, making us it's either masculine or feminine as far as like men or women, and I think that a lot of times it's hard for them it's hard for us Black folks to accept, not us, but it's hard for a lot of Black people to accept something that's different. And it's really sad to me because, as far as like drag, I can give a good example. it's interesting because with some of the Black community, I get so much love, right? And then I get that homophobia and that like that scaredness from even when I'm at shows from like Black women and like Black men, and I'm like, but wait a minute though, like, but then it's okay for Tyler Perry to be Medea, and that's funny. But if I take drag seriously, then that's an issue. So it's like that's always my biggest issue. It's like, why can't I be who I am and still be accepted, and like it's frowned upon. I think it's sad that, you know, Tyler Perry still would get to hire a drag queen to be in any production, you know, and or any, you know, trans performer to be in any production. And I think that it really, really definitely, you know, takes us to look at ourselves and really, really like think about it. And I love what she said. Like, yes, you have to look about what makes you, and also I want to add on to that, what makes you look at them makes you feel so insecure about yourself as well.
Yeah. I'm just digesting the, I'm thinking about a few different things, and it is the one is that, and I don't think this has come up in this space, but I do think that there's sometimes this narrative that continues that Black people are uniquely homophobic, and I always like to push back against that, right? Like, I don't think that Black folks are uniquely homophobic, queerphobic. I think it comes up in unique ways that are unique to our culture and how we live with one another, right? And I think when we think about that, I'm also, another thing that's coming to mind, and it was a kind of a comical conversation about gaydar, if you will. And somebody had kind of theorized that gaydar is not the recognition of queerness, but rather the absence of straightness. And that is that straightness sometimes is a very rigid and kind of passed down way of living that a lot of times our spaces, our Black spaces, have adopted to make it easier to navigate the world that we live in. So perhaps we have clung on to ideas, not that they are not valuable, not that they are not good in any type of way, or not that they don't serve any purpose, but perhaps there is sometimes that we have clung on to a certain white definition of family and sexuality, and specifically the nuclear family, right, to aid our ability to live in this world and navigate this world. And thus we have adopted these things in certain ways that are rigid, that confine us. When in fact, if going back to that thing and talking about Sadiya Hartman and Wayward Lives, and that we already have all of these experiences of folks of queerness living and being expressed. And I think about explicitly the Black church. We can't talk about the Black church without the way that queerness exists within it, right? And the way that we celebrate, the way that we engage in our praise and worship, right? I have never been in a Black church that was not being led, whether it was acknowledged or not, with Black queerness somewhere at the forefront. That is just my experience. And I don't know if that's not, that's my experience, right? And so how is that informing us? How is that living? How is that keeping us going? And how do we acknowledge that as our strength? And how do we cultivate and support that in one another in the face of all of these other things that we are experiencing? And so that's kind of one of the ways I think that I try to navigate it for myself and encourage others, is appreciating that gem and that value and that beauty in one another. And I continue to think that queerness is a beauty and a way that we can think about a world that we do not currently live in and exist in, right? That there's so many norms and so many values that have been kind of pushed upon us to the degree that sometimes we don't even recognize that they are not who we are and how we can survive in the world. So how do we identify those strengths, that beauty? And I always kind of believe that a lot of that exists in queerness.
Letting go of that rigidness, the constant need to have someone adhere to what you think is the way to navigate our world. And as you said, too often we are adopting ideologies that were never even our own. White colonialism is something that is embedded in all of our communities at this point, that we have to be able to acknowledge trace that history a little bit, and then step away from it and re-find the freedom to just be. And stop telling people that the way that you're living is harming when it is doing absolutely nothing. Has nothing to do with you. We are too consumed with this notion of, oh my God, Billy Porter is emasculating all Black men. He is redefining and is going to shift our culture for the worse. What? You are so concerned with someone finding freedom within themselves that you're not allowing that to happen. Thank you, Darren. Lil Nas X, right? How folks are up in arms about him pushing the gay agenda. I love how he flipped the scripts and just trolls people. It's so funny. But at the same time, there is that essence of fear. And I hope folks are listening and understanding where sometimes that fear is coming from. We have to be willing to find that sense of freedom, right? I promise you, Lil Nas X is not going to turn your children queer. Promise you.
Your children were already queer, if you know what I mean.
There's a release. There is a release that happens when you see people living authentically. And that release scares. It scares people so much. But we have to allow that fear not to drive so much of how we engage with other people. All right, last question from our panelists, then we're going to open it up to our audience for Q&A. As we close out with our panelists here for the moment, could you please, some of which you've already done, please provide a few tangible tips, a couple of things that folks can actually do. You've already shared a few, but sometimes we talk a lot, but what can we do? Any tips and suggestions on how we as Black folks can be strong, active accomplices and stand in solidarity with our LGBTQ plus siblings? Any thoughts?
I think it really starts with yourself. You have to have a lot of self-love first. If you don't have any self-love, you can't go anywhere. So you have to love yourself and be secure with yourself. Just because a straight person is cool with a gay person, that doesn't mean, like, everyone always has opinions, right? If you're secure with who you are, then that's all you really, really need. And it also takes you talking to maybe some of your family members who don't necessarily agree or don't understand. Have a conversations. And just like how we're doing now, it's all about having a conversation. People are so quick to go off and yell and scream and fight or like, I hate this or I don't like that. Instead of, why don't you sit down and have a conversation? You know, I know a lot of times when I walk out of if I'm fully dressed in drag and I walk out, a lot of people will look at me, Black folks will look at me like I'm crazy. But I'm like, if we actually have a conversation, you don't know how much we might have in common. So it's like, yeah, it really does start with ourselves. And it really does start with that self-love.
Michelle, I was gonna say it starts with those immediately around us, and I appreciate that you said it's ourselves, because it absolutely is. And I was thinking, and there was something else that Malik said earlier that I can't remember exactly, but it reminded me specifically of, you're speaking of Lil Nas X, and specifically a Penn alum, Ashawn Crawley, who has wrote extensively about some of his own experiences with queerness, and specifically growing up in the Pentecostal church. But he wrote this about Lil Nas' impact on him, and specifically that Lil Nas X was the individual that he needed to see as a young person, as a mentor, and kind of seeing his experiences lived out, right? And for that own kind of freedom and liberation that I think that you're talking about, Vinchelle, starting with ourselves. How do we find our own liberation? What messages have we received and internalized, and that then have caused us to lash out on others because of our fear of what lives inside of us? And that's when I think about how a lot of these phobias and harms manifest itself. I was reaching around my desk, and because I realized this book was actually on my desk, but again, this is The Lonely Letters. This is Ashawn Crawley. This is just kind of reflections and thinking about the loneliness of some of his own queer experiences that is manifested and written through letters. And I just bring that into the space because he once was a part of this community here at Penn.
When you asked that question, I started, as Vinchelle and Malik were talking, I was jotting down a few things. I love what both of you said. You're dead on, Vinchelle, when you said it starts with us. You're absolutely right. But I wrote down some tips that I often share, and that's speak up against wrongdoing, even when it feels scary. Recognize that the leadership and the power belongs to the LGBTQ community when we're doing this work. Take the time and the initiative to educate yourself about the LGBT community, and that is one of the most important steps. And remembering it is not the responsibility of the LGBTQ person to increase your knowledge, to educate you.
Yes, 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 yes to all of that, especially the piece of self-love. Because so often we are holding on to this notion of who we're supposed to be, trying to fit into whatever box we think we're supposed to be in, and then allowing that own self-hate to be projected to other folks. But also do that work, educate yourself, and don't lean on only queer folks to teach you, right? It's not our job. Okay, it is my job because I actually get paid to do this to some degree, right? But
it's kind of mine too.
right? Come to us, right? We are willing to do that, but don't do that to folks in their everyday lives, right? The emotional labor that it takes to have to educate folks about the validity of your identity is wild, right? And we stepped into these roles and these positions because we are ready to do it. Other folks are not quite there, and you should not put them in that space. It's not their job. Not their job.
Yeah. You know, I've often explained that to Black and brown folks that expecting an LGBTQ person to educate you about the community is much like white people expecting us to educate them on how to be less racist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As one of you mentioned earlier, a part of it is to lean into an understanding that our injustices and oppressions are interconnected. And you can find that sense of empathy by recognizing the harms that you have ever felt are probably also felt very much so by LGBTQ plus folks, and even more so a little bit, right? But don't let that fear, right, put you into a place of causing harm, even unintentionally. So let me say thank you. Thank you to our panelists for sharing so much insight and wisdom with the questions that we already asked. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to our audience. Darren, if you could maybe get us back to our gallery view, just so we're all here together. I invite you, if you would like to bring your cameras up to be in this space with us together. You can either feel free to unmute yourself and just start speaking and ask your question, or feel free to pop it into the chat. Both totally viable ways of bringing forward any questions that you may have. It could be for an individual panelist, it could be for all of them, however you'd like to do it.
Hi.
Go on, Mario.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much, everybody. This has been really, really great, and I appreciate it. I think my question is just the process of growing as you're educating yourself or becoming an ally or becoming more in solidarity, and how to give people room and space without excusing their behavior. Because I know sometimes people are like, I'm against this until it's like uncomfortable for them, like until the new Kanye album comes out and the baby's on the song, or, you know, things of that nature. So my question is how to give people grace, but still hold them accountable. And also, do you feel like cancel culture helps or hurts when it comes to like the growth process of people?
That's a really good question. Really, really good question. I talked about this too on my talk show as well that I do. You know, cancel culture, I don't think it's healthy. Honestly, I don't think cancel culture is healthy. I'm going to go ahead and put that out there. I think education is healthy. I think learning is healthy. I think people make mistakes. Now, when it comes to like people like the baby and stuff like that, listen, I wasn't a fan before, so I'm not going to be a fan. You know what I mean? I'm not going to be a fan now. And my thing about some people is that some people are so quick to jump and try to cancel someone who they don't even support in the first place. So why can't they just go ahead and let them learn, and you keep where you are, keep them afar and do that. But in other instance, I do think that people's reckless mouths and reckless attitudes and reckless actions have to be stopped as well. So I'm kind of in the middle with that. I would love to hear what everyone else has to say.
Yeah, I think, hey, Mary, it was very good to see you. And it's a great question because I think that is one of the most difficult and challenging things about any types of like harms and experiences of like how we want to show up. And one of the ways that I like to think about it is, well, for one, when I think about cancel culture, I think about cancel culture as a term and a concept as the way to describe the way to describe what is ultimately amounts to punitive measures that have been flipped in terms of power, right? So traditionally, we are used to individuals with power that have power based off their identity, canceling individuals in our society who have less power, right? And we think about that, that is best manifested through something like mass incarceration. I think cancel culture is an attempt to kind of describe that flipping of that, right? And I think that's important to name because I think that is what causes the most flags. But then I also agree that it doesn't come from a space of thinking about how we're reflecting about our experiences, how we're learning from it, and how we're growing, and how we are like moving in and out of these experiences. And so one thing that I like to think about is like, so one thing that comes up often is language, and the language that others use. And I do think that there is a quote unquote policing of language in the sense that it kind of borrows that same logics of like, you can't do this and you can't say this. And what if instead of we think to ourselves, well, you can't do this and you can't say this, is we're thinking about an opportunities of what does our language say about how we're experiencing the world? What does this say about somebody's experiences? How does it match up and meet up with our experience? And what is the language that we need that kind of, it maybe is not a synthesis, but it's something that is allowing us to learn or allowing this individual to learn. That may not be our responsibility. I think one of the biggest things that, when we talk about violence advocacy, that what we train and educate on violence is that recognize your capacity, recognize where you do have the ability to show up and where you don't. There's some things that are way too personal and way too sensitive for me that I can't necessarily support you with and help you in your growth because this is too much about my personal experience. There may be other people who can do it, and there may be other ways that I can support and help shepherd you in your growth, depending on our relationship, right? And so, we have to free ourselves from the desire to have this very black and white answer about how we navigate these situations and think to ourselves, who is this individual in my life? What is my relationship to them? And what are the ways that I can and should show up in an ability to help them grow, right? Out of a place of love. And sometimes that may be a little vague and kind of esoteric, but I do think that it is the necessity to think about what are those relationships and work off it from there.
Thank you for sharing that, Malik. I think for me, I think my feelings around the cancel culture kind of varies depending on who it is. And I'm just gonna be just, straight up, at times, most of the times when it's a white person, I'm like, yeah, cancel their ass, but when it comes to, like, I know that the baby said some messed up stuff and everyone was upset about it, but I often, when I hear them say, oh, the LGBT community is upset. And I'm like, okay, who are upset? Because a lot of the Black and brown people that I deal with, the guy that lives up the street that calls me out my name or something like that I'm dealing with, I'm not really concerned with the baby because the baby actually lives on my block. That's what I'm dealing with. There's a guy that actually says those things, that does those things, that thinks that same way that I have to navigate in my real life. So I don't always have the capacity to jump on board, to be upset with Chick-fil-A, because sometimes, when the community is, I don't have the capacity to always jump on board with the cancel culture and all of these things that, because I am still living in survival mode every day.
Excellent question,
This is
Mario.
Darren. As far as cancel culture, the one thing that I think about when it's either a left or right is that it doesn't provide that space for something to be teachable. We tend to forget that some people are so ingrained in their beliefs that have been passed down through the years, culturally, intergenerational, and trying to get them to go against family members, go against the grandmothers, the grandfathers, in a way that they believe in a particular way of how people should be. And they may not be as open-minded. So once we cancel them, we don't give them the ability, in my view, to change. It's almost like saying I'm flashing a mirror in front of a drug addict down Kensington and Allegheny and say, hey, look at yourself. This is you. How do you feel about change? And it doesn't resonate. It takes a lot to really work on people about change and what the change process looks like. And I think cancel culture does a huge disservice when it comes to giving people that opportunity to learn from something.
Yeah, Dan, you bring up such a great point, and you all have quantified this so well. That's why when we talk about folks and how sometimes there is an unlearning and a learning that has to happen, I bring it forward from this notion of an unwillingness to learn, right? Because a lot of times folks aren't even bringing themselves to the space of wanting or even taking a little bit of trying to learning. They're just so rooted without really honing or examining why they are so rooted in that way, right? Which is why I love Selena making that suggestion of just asking the question why, right? And really digging deep, because when you get down to the root of it, you might find that you can open and expand your mind a little bit. But it's that unwillingness that I think will eventually should lead to that person being canceled, because you're not even attempting to open your mind, right? I'm all here for it takes time. These things are very much so rooted. They are ingrained in who we are as a society. But if you're not even willing to attempt, I don't know. There was a question in the chat and a suggestion. If folks could put into the chat some of the books that you named or some of the resources that you think might be helpful, if you could just put them into the chat so folks can look them up themselves, that would be amazing. Malik, I know you had a couple books that you mentioned. Selena, there were some folks that you mentioned as well. So feel free to add some resources in the chat if you feel comfortable to do so. Darren, you did have a question that was posted in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. But Colleen, I see you also raising your hand. Did you have a question? We'll come to you, Colleen, and then we'll come back to Darren's question in the chat.
So I know that I had to check to see, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So I know that tonight's topic is embracing our Black LGBTQ siblings, which I understand that the two identities are very much intertwined. But I also heard Selena earlier say that as Black people, we are really good at choosing our battles. So I have a two-part question, and it is, can you find liberation and freedom as a queer if you have not found that same liberation and freedom as a Black person? And I just remember my uncle saying to my cousin, it's already hard enough for you to be Black, and now you want to be gay. And so the second part of my question is, where is the allyship and support most critical based on which carries with this, being Black or being a queer, the most residual impact and harm? And that's open to anybody who want to answer that.
Can you give me that first part again?
Oh, the first part, I said, can you find liberation and freedom as a queer if you have not also found that liberation and freedom as a Black?
For me, I don't think so. Because before my sex gender was determined, before I am anything, I am Black. So for me, my Blackness supersedes most of how I show up. But the sad part of that is when I show up to most Black spaces, my trans identity is what is received first. But for me, I don't separate the two. But I mean, you have to, I mean, to really support me and show up for me how I need you to show up for me, you have to understand both of those identities. You can't, and that's where a lot of times we see these organizations wanting to support us in our trans identity, but you can't fully support that identity if you don't understand me as a Black person.
Thank you.
Now, the second part.
The second part was, I said, and I think you kind of answered it. I said, where is the allyship most critical?
Oh, yeah.
Because which carries with it the most residual impact and harm, that of the queerness, of your Blackness.
Well, I think if we don't address the intersection of those two identities, then that's where the harm comes in.
Mm.
I agree with everything that Kalina just said. Honestly, it's right on the money. Honestly, it's anytime I walk into any room, before I'm anything, I am Black. Before anything, and putting the two together is something definitely to think about. I think that question is an amazing question. Truly, that's why you had me up here like, I was on mute, but I was like, great question. Truly, I agree with everything that Kalina just said. Truly, I do. I can add on more, but I think she said it perfectly.
Yeah, Colleen, I'm thinking about the second part that you shared, and that is like, where is it most important? And I would be, I would struggle to like try to identify that or try to speak. I know it's maybe most important for me. And I think what's most important for me is like thinking about those small interactions around the people that we're interacting with the most and the people that we love. And maybe this is even speaking to kind of the question that Malik asked earlier and thinking about moving beyond, Pride Month activities and kind of that energy, which is that sometimes, we might attach ourselves to larger things and say, well, I believe in this, but how does it actually show up around us? And so like thinking really critically about, and even, Vinchelle, like that first thing, like myself, like what messages have I received about gender and sexuality, and how has that impacted some of my own feelings and fears, right, about myself, right? Malik and I do discussions about masculinity often, and one of the things that comes up often, people from all around the world, different cultures, different backgrounds, languages, religions, talk about the experiences of growing up as boys and being told not to do certain things because boys don't do that, right? And sometimes the response being, violent, that being violently enforced. You cannot do such because you are a boy, right? And at some point, maybe you grow beyond these messages and you learn, you just live, you become an adult and you live as you wish. But for many of us, we still carry our experiences and the messages that we received as young people. And they impact not only how we view ourselves, but with how we treat people around us. And increasingly, as I think about how I want to show up and support people in my role for people who have experienced trauma and violence and various forms of harm and phobias and so forth, it has increasingly pushed me to do my own work about what my own experiences are. And I think that puts me in the best position to show up for the people that I love and the people that I care about.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Colleen, that was an excellent question, because I think you always have a beautiful way of bringing forward what people are really thinking about, right? And how that essence of, I'm always Black no matter where I go. So how do I find even the courage to have to fight for my queer identity as well? I'll tell you now, from my own experience, they are intertwined. They have to be. I was raised in an Islamic household. I was raised in an African-American Muslim community. I did not come out until I was a freshman in college. And I did that because I had the opportunity to just be free. And I was tired of lying to myself and lying to other people, right? The burden was way too much. But once I got to that place, I was able to accept all of me, including my Blackness, right? So having that sense of freedom be found as early as possible is how we are going to be the best that we can be. Have to stop limiting each other so much. We get stuck. We get so stuck. And that's how the harm continues to perpetuate, right? As long as somebody is not harming themselves or someone else, let them be. Let them be. But don't allow, like Malik was talking about, that sense of care to drive you to engage in harmful ways. Because that is deeply rooted within our Black and African American communities. So rooted. And with that, we are at our time. We are at our time, folks. Snap it out. We want to snap it out for every single one of you for being here today. A huge, huge round of applause to our amazing panelists, Selena, Malik, Vinchel. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time and energy to be here today. We know that it is not easy to bring forward so much of yourself, but also carry the weight at times of an overarching community. But I promise you here and now, we are not speaking for the entire community. We're speaking from the experiences that we have had and from the experiences that we have from folks who have been engaged in our lives. And I encourage you all to continue to do the same, right? Speak from who you are and how you engage in this world, and take a little bit of effort to recognize and acknowledge experiences outside of your own. I'll end with a quote by the late, great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He once said, "An individual has not started living until they can rise above the narrow confines of their own individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." We have to do better. Collaboration is the only way that we as a people are going to be able to move forward. So let's figure out how to do it, especially within our own community. So thank you, thank you, thank you again. Keep an eye out for the recording. It will be available on our YouTube channels and on our Facebook. Follow our newsletters if you don't already. But again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Don't let this be the end all be all. This hour-and-a-half conversation is not it. It has to continue.
It has to
bring it home. Bring it home. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. I had an ending, but I'm gonna tell you right now, Malik dropped the mic and he said everything that I wanted to say. And I really appreciate, listen, let me just first thank Selena for being such an advocate and being out there and the words that you expressed, and also Brother Malik, who's always dropping some jewels, and he's just so smooth about it, from Pittsburgh. I love the brother, he's a good man. I also want to thank Michelle too. Oh my God, you came in and just bow. You know, you kind of left us like, oh wow. And I really appreciate you sharing and some of the quotes that you left us with, and especially you said it starts with self-love. To me, that meant a lot. So I just want to thank you, and just thank everybody. And Colleen, thank you for for thinking about this topic and how important it is within our community and our families. And with that being said, Malik mentioned how to get in touch with us. We'll have it on YouTube. We'll have it on our Facebook page, and continue to follow our Race, Solidarity, and Allyship program. We thank you so much. And to our presenters, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Or the evening, I should say.
That's right.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Bye, Vinchel.
Bye, everybody.
Got you. Yes. Definitely.